I always go into these things thinking, what if I just have a total brain fart?
Yeah.
And, like, have no idea what to say.
Dude, it's
everything in my teeth.
Nothing in your teeth.
No.
Right?
Oh, so I saw that camera and I was
There's-
cool. No, you're doing great.
There's you're at.
This goes like, just make sure you're kind of conscious of that a little.
Do
bit.
I want to be close to it or?
No, that's good. Yeah, you're good like that.
You're at 2 a week now.
I do a second one every other week, so I'm doing like 6 a month. Yeah,
That's a lot.
So it definitely ramped up.
Do you feel the difference? Like, is that a big change?
Yeah, I mean, it was like, it's sort of like when you have one kid, and that's a lot of work, and then when you have a second child, you think it's going to be double the amount of work, but it's like 5 times the amount. It's sort of like that. But I've been better about like batching and systematizing what I do and delegating and things like that. So
That's good.
it hasn't been that bad.
Do you do most of them here in person? I know you do some stuff like I see.
Yeah, I mean, when I travel, like I take my stuff with me, so I do them on the road. And then, sometimes people like, I want to do it, but there's no way I'm driving to Calabasas. So,
Sure.
I'll make exceptions. But I'm trying to do them here as much as possible. So thank you for making the way out here today. I'm super excited to talk to you both. As I kind of posted on Instagram the other day, it just warmed my heart to be at the screening of the movie and to see two people that I care for and respect deeply get together to create something that's greater than the sum of its parts. It was just such a cool thing because I know each of you independent of each other, and then to see two people that like I have so much respect for like collaborate and make this amazing thing. It was a really special thing. So I can't imagine what it's like for you, but I was really honored to be at the screening. The movie is incredible, and it's now out in the world, and that's gotta be an exciting feeling for you guys.
Yeah, it's really exciting for me. It's
It was
probably
Andrew's
strange
idea.
for you.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, Rob's
no
very clear
edit.
to point that out. Yeah.
I just don't want to. I don't want to get any credit thrown my way for what was all Andrew.
Well, it's a cool story in that you had not seen the movie until the premiere,
Yes.
which put you in a precarious, sort of emotional state, I would imagine. How was that?
Yeah.
How was that watching it for the first time?
It was totally surreal and overwhelming. I was sort of prepared for it and sort of not. And sitting like in the fourth row with my wife, Kristen, and then our kids, and something about the fact that my kids went to the concession stand and had like popcorn and candy. Somehow it's one of my enduring memories of looking down the row at my family watching this movie, or my kids watching this movie about their dad. Somehow it's like weird, the details, but it had like a "this is your life" sort of thing.
Yeah.
Like almost like an out of body. This is like if we showed you this is where your life is going, you'd be like, no way.
Right.
Yeah.
And you set up on stage afterwards like, oh, like that's how I sound and this is how it's coming off.
Right. Like that feeling in the 80s when your parents got an answering machine and you, as kids, you're like recording like, hello, you've called our house. And then you'd play it back and be like, I remember talking with my sister and me like, wait, is that what my voice sounds like? This was like a really big version of that.
Yeah. It's so funny. And what's kind of, curious about it, Andrew, is that you kind of did this kind of quietly and surreptitiously. Like you weren't checking in with Rob. Like at one point, Rob, you're like, is that thing still, are you still making that movie like 5 years later? And you must have been, when you came on the podcast originally, Andrew, you must have been in the midst of shooting at that time too, and you didn't mention anything about it at that time. Like you seem like somebody who, as an artist, like really likes to keep things under wraps until you're ready to say anything about it.
Yeah, that's a nice way of saying it. I think there's a lot of things that have fallen through, for me, and I think sometimes I've realized it's just better to talk about it after the fact. And also though, I think there's actually something. This one is the most private thing we've ever done, and I think there was something when you talk about it. I think you give a little bit of it away in a certain sense, like for your own sake. Like this one was very personal and it was very private, all the way up until the point that we released it. And I like doing it this way better. Having done it this way, we've crowdfunded and other things before that kind of requires you to be a lot more upfront. But this was just a really, I don't know, just creatively speaking, this was pretty pure. This like. Independent financing, no one over our shoulder, no timeline, and it's a really good way to make something.
Yeah, and it's beautifully conceptualized and put together. I think it paints an incredible portrait of Rob and who you are as a human being, and the work that you do and the impact that your work is having on the world. And I said to Andrew before you got here, I was like, you watch the movie, and even if you had no idea who Rob is, you leave that movie with, I think, a pretty good sense of what you're all about and the impact that you're trying to have. You know, he did really capture your essence by following you around those many years, you know, and it's cool. And I think there's something about the way the universe conspires to to manifest these types of things at the perfect moment, because we're experiencing a very unique period of time right now. I mean, just last week, as I'm sure you saw, there was that bizarre church that held that vigil where people were wearing crowns of bullets, and they were sort of heralded. People brought in their AR-15s, and you know, admittedly, this is a very, you know, fringe, you know, organization, but at the same time, I couldn't help but think how, in some ways, that perfectly captures kind of what's going on culturally right now, where we have conflated ideas around faith and religion and the church and Jesus with ideas that kind of swirl around the flag and guns and nationalism. Like we're at a fever pitch with this right now. And I think that kind of goes to the heart at many of the things that you talk about.
Absolutely. And if you think about human development for thousands of years, there's the move from egocentric to tribal-centric, but then the absolutely necessary development from tribal-centric to world-centric. And in times of great change or disruption or crisis or trauma, we as individuals, there's always the temptation, will this pain break you open so that you'll move to greater inclusion, complexity, and depth? Or will the pain cause you to regress, to dig in your heels? And you're seeing right now...
A lot of digging in.
Yeah, you're seeing right now a regression to tribal ethnocentrism.
Do you feel like that's a natural, part of the natural process of eventually transcending that?
Yeah, right. I mean, that is the question. And the arc... I mean, the really interesting thing about the arc of the universe is it keeps moving forward. I mean, that's the great mystery at the heart of it all, is particles forms atom, and atoms bond together and form molecules, and molecules form cells. Like, it has a natural drive to an unfolding unity, weirdly enough, underneath it all. So even hearing about whatever that church service thing is, I'm sure your listeners are like, wait, there's something very wrong. That's the wrong direction. So even in saying, how could they do that? You're gathering with millions of people going, and that's not where we're headed. You know what I mean?
I hope not.
Right.
But we are seeing this reversion to, these ideas of nationalism and this kind of reverence for our automatic weapons and a sort of wrapping ourselves in the flag as if that somehow has anything to do with the truth behind the Christian traditions and what Jesus was all about. And like, it's so bizarre and confusing.
Yeah. And the human heart, we want something to be sacred and holy. We want depth. We want a sense of wonder and awe in our lives. And what's interesting is the gun for a segment of the population has become the new unquestioned absolute. It's become the sacred thing.
And why do you think that is?
I actually would argue that America was birthed. Even the story that when we were in school about how Columbus discovered America, and you're like, was anybody already here? Yes. So
footnote.
How have you discovered something if someone's already there?
Yeah.
So in some senses, the narrative was skewed from the get-go.
Well, you speak about this all the time, that history is dictated by the winners.
By the winners.
Right? This is the prism through which we interpret historical events.
So we quickly marginalized the people who were here, in some cases outright slaughtered. And then much of that early economy was built on the backs of slaves. And when this tribe gathers to sing, our national anthem has the line, bombs bursting in air. Like when we sing of our unifying myth, we talk about bombs. So we're about 4% of the world's population. We have something like 40% of its weaponry. By the way, this is the nation with 750 bases, military bases around the world. This is the one nation that has the most mass shootings. Mm-hmm. So there is a violence built into the whole thing, and it just keeps coming up. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that is the great thing that's being unmasked. Mm-hmm. Is the story has been peace, prosperity, freedom, democracy, which we're all for, but it has had an underbelly of violence.
Yeah, there's this percolating sort of, fermentation of dissatisfaction and disassociation and frustration with a lot of people who, kind of did the right thing,
Yes.
went to church on Sunday and got the job and, went to college or whatever and climbed that corporate ladder and arrived at a place only to discover that, to coin a phrase that you've used in the past, like maybe they put the ladder up against the wrong wall. Like,
right.
Where's that sense of peace and fulfillment and purpose that I was promised? Mm-hmm. And then when you're left with that and you have been sort of disillusioned by the traditions of religion, what do you do with that energy?
Right. And you have lots of people who are witnessing to this system didn't deliver what it was supposed to deliver.
Yeah.
Even when I was traveling in the Bible Belt last year in the Deep South, and Andrew was filming, the sense...
None of those things are recommended,
yeah.
by the way.
Yeah, well, you just keep going back. Like you haven't even gotten in full swing on the Holy Shift tour, right? Like you're still going down south and...
Oh, we go all over.
Yeah.
We go all over. But it was so interesting how many people, the up and to the right understanding of things, well, you'll make more money and you'll get more square footage. Like, as long as it's up and to the right, it must be good. Mm-hmm. The unquestioned adherence and affirmation of more, Amazon can get it cheaper within 2 hours, then that must be good. And people beginning to question that story, which for many people was the dominant story.
Right. And the kind of ladder analogy falls apart because that implies that there's a top rung, but there's always another rung.
Yes.
So once you get to that rung, you're like, well, I'm not feeling it yet, but that new Tesla is coming out next year or whatever. Like there's always another something to clutch at, thinking this is the thing that's going to solve that hole in my heart.
Yeah. And I love Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with Martin Luther King, this legendary rabbi. He said, I didn't ask for success, I asked for wonder. And then he says, and God gave it to me. That what you actually want is a sense of wonder and awe. You want to wake up in the morning with a sense of, I get to do this. That's actually the thing that everybody wants. Mm-hmm. And we'll trade lots of things for that.
So how do we pursue that?
Well, it's interesting how many people, when you ask them about their life, I'm struck with how many people witness to a thread that has been there from way back. There's something that was speaking to them the whole time. And sometimes, like, I have a relative who, if anything's broken, he becomes exhilarated because he gets to fix it. Like, just set him anywhere, and he comes to life when there's something that needs to be mended. I know people who are healers. You show them somebody with a broken heart and they come to life. I know people who, we could go around this table and talk about people we know who they've been bent a particular way since the very, very, since way back. Mm-hmm. So the most interesting thing to me is just start asking people questions. When did you most feel alive? When have you been caught up in something that you lost track of time? Mm-hmm. What is something that when you do it, it's both exhausting but strangely exhilarating? You're tired, but it's good tired. Mm-hmm. What is it that when you do it, you think, man, I could do this forever? It's interesting how many people can witness to something.
I also think that's a really hard question to answer for a lot of people.
Yes.
Because we're so disconnected.
Right.
We've never been asked that question before.
Yes. Even asking people what they want. How many people lock up even at that basic question? Desire as something that was supposed to be repressed and sublimated for the greater of something, as opposed to, no, seriously, like, what do you want?
And so how do you think about faith and religion and spirituality in that context?
I begin with the whole thing as a gift, and how you respond to it matters. I begin with gift. You're here. And regardless of how your heart's been broken and how easy it is to roll your eyes and fall prey to cynicism and all the money you've lost and relationships that fell apart, something within you, this is a gift, and you know it, that you're here and you're breathing. Mm-hmm. So let's start there. And how you respond to it matters. And despair is the spiritual disease of, it doesn't really matter. Despair is tomorrow will just be a repeat of today. None of it really matters.
Or despair can get manifest in these violent outbursts that we're seeing.
Yes, exactly.
With regularity.
So I begin there, and then oftentimes it's the imagination. If despair is tomorrow will simply be a repeat of today, there's like a disruption. There's the invitation to a disruption, which is, what if tomorrow wasn't like today? What if, some people move into smaller houses so they have less bills, so they don't have to work as much. Mm-hmm. Like, I'll do that with a live audience, and people will laugh really hard at that, because I think it's a joke, but they'll laugh at that like, oh, you're right. It's amazing the amount of times I've done stuff around that. You could work for the next 18 months and save and then leave and go travel. People do that. I do it sort of like tongue-in-cheek, over the top, but it's amazing to the number of people. Or you could quit your job. People do that because they realize that it's actually killing them. It's amazing the number of people who quit their jobs on the spot. I say my batting average is
I know
improving.
you cause a lot of people to quit their jobs.
But I did an event, and a guy raises his hand and he says, okay, I have a question. He says, I'm a lawyer, and I have this office full of lawyers, and I decided to expand my law firm. So we opened up a second office 2 hours away, and then I hired a bunch of lawyers for that office. So I'm driving back and forth between the two. He says, then I hired someone in charge of human resources. Then I hired a CFO, and now we've got more cases, more clients, more money coming in, and I'm feeling all this pressure. I'm feeling all this I got to keep this whole thing going. Mm-hmm. I was like, hold on. Who hired all the people? He's like, I did. I was like, who decided to open a second office? I did. Who decided to bring in a human resources director and a CFO? He's like, I did. I said, do you feel like you're pushing a rock up a hill? He's like, yeah. I was like, who built the rock?
Right.
He's like, I did. I was like, well, what do you want? What kind of life do you want? How many hours do you want to work? How many employees do you want? How many cases do you want? And what's so fascinating, he's like, I don't know. I never thought about it. It was like a reflexive, just build it. Yeah.
Because it's living. It's in response to just the cultural mores of build and grow and get bigger, and and I would imagine even at times he probably thought, well, if I hire all these people, then it will reduce the load on me. But ultimately, it just increases the amount
headaches.
of pressure.
And to me, that's the great gift of a tradition, faith, spirituality, religion. Ideally, is it creates space where you can reflect, where you have village elders, ideally, who are way older than you, but younger at some important level, who can help you sift and sort what matters, what doesn't. So I would say that those spaces where you can ask questions and be asked questions about your life, and there are resources and people who can say, oh, yeah, I've been through that. The solidarity of someone can be like, oh, yeah, I faced the same question. Here's how I answered it. I would start at the most basic level with that.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, when did you first meet Rob? And what got you interested in
we met.
This?
It's interesting. It's really interesting listening to you guys talk. I think we met 3 years ago at a birthday party that our daughters were attending. Yeah. And we started a conversation, and I was very, very, very interested on a personal level. I'd grown up in a very conservative, religious, evangelical place, and I'd kind of grown away from a lot of that. And I think I had really thrown my life into what I felt like were some of the emergencies happening on planet Earth, and I kind of didn't care. I didn't really have time. I wasn't interested in things that felt non-important to that endeavor. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I think, even when I talked to you last time, Rich, I think I'd come through a period of time where I had begun to look at the world and realize that there were some root causes that kept bringing an enormous amount of pain to the surface. And there were some things that if we were going to get serious about really creating a more just, humane, beautiful future up ahead, that we couldn't just put Band-Aids on like ancillary items. We were going to have to get serious about like, what are the stories, what are the assumptions, what are the narratives that built this world? Because it's not working. It's not working. Soaring inequality, environmental crisis, mental health, refugee crisis. Go down the list. I think as a person, maybe it was part of it was just kind of coming out of the arrogance of youth. Like when you're really young, you think you have it figured, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So for me, it was like, we'll just make enough sad documentaries and people will do the right thing.
The world will spin the other way on its axis.
So I think what I was really asking is, what is it going to take for human beings to wake up? Mm-hmm. And so when I met Rob, not only was it interesting because of some of my personal past and background, I think I felt like some of what he was articulating, some of the questions he was asking, cut to the very heart, to the very center of what kind of world are we making and why? Mm-hmm. And the damage of some of those spiritual, religious, faith-based stories is egregious and continues to be. And yet, I think there is a hollow center if there's nothing else, if there's nothing pulling us towards an openness, a training on how we get violence out of circulation, a guide to how I forgive people who have like really hurt me. Those things that he was articulating were just really fascinating. And as I started to follow him around to a couple of events, I began to realize my story wasn't that rare, that I think there's a lot of people, and by a lot, I mean like a lot of people who grew up, were handed some narrow tradition. It didn't keep pace with the complexity of the world they found themselves in, and they kind of put it aside. And probably rightfully so in a lot of things. And yet, as Pete Holmes says in the film, they still felt an ache. Right. They still felt a longing for a space to keep them open to the possibility of just how significant this place is, just how important this story that we're somehow mystically in the middle of is. Like, that was just really fascinating stuff to me. So I sat down with Rob and Kristen and I just said, I've never made a film like this. It doesn't really make sense on paper, but I'd like to film some of the conversations that we've been having. I'd like to film the work you're doing, some of the people that you're doing it with, and then we'll see what it turns into.
Right. See if there'll be a movie, without knowing, like going into, this unknown territory of just like hoping something will happen or a narrative will appear. Yeah. And that was like 5 years ago, right?
Yeah. That was like 3.5 years ago. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that timing too, Rich, is that was 2015, and in 2015, I think, and it's interesting. Like Rob, you're a very, very optimistic person, Rob, and that's amazing. And that's I said that night at the premiere, you're one of the least cynical people I've ever known, and I've benefited immensely from that. But I also think when we started filming, that was 2015. And in 2015, I think we all felt like Obama was going to get a third term, that we were somehow on this like slide towards inevitable progress in some not so subtle ways. And then 2016 came around, and it was like, I think all the volume got turned up, and I think we had a fresh reminder of just how destructive bad stories can be to the individual human psyche, all the way to the collective life we have together. And I think it was at that moment that I was like, I wanted to make the film, and now I know why we're making the film.
Yeah, I mean, set against the backdrop of what's happening culturally right now, it just makes it extremely relevant. We're so divided and we're confused about what's important, and that ache that Pete talks about in the movie is very real, and I think all of us can relate to it. And whether we were brought up in the church or with no tradition whatsoever, we've kind of bought into this cultural gestalt of more, and consume our way to bliss and happiness. And when we find out that doesn't solve the wound, and we're left wanting, and our heart is yearning for something more, where do we look? And I think that despondency can grow out of that, or it can mushroom cloud into twisted notions of what faith is all about that further divide us.
And that's, I think, like the only upside of that is that the tremendous gift this moment gives us is this kind of fresh humility that we've come to the end of a lot of stories. Like, we've played out several stories now. The consumer story, the wealth, build it, the success, the even some of the America story that's really starting to show its cracks. That's profound, because we've put a lot of passive faith in those stories serving us well. And so to wake up to a moment where we're like, globally on the environmental level, that's not working. The consumer story leads us to a horrendous end. The way we produce food, you go down the line, and I think that's the amazing thing that's happening is we are like in this world between worlds. Like we really are still living in a world that was kind of built like out of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, like really, like even our metaphors and our assumptions like are still they're so out of pace with where we are, and yet somehow we've lacked the collective imagination to get serious about what's next. And you see on a variety of levels. So like, we have soaring inequality. We have an economic system that is, even the most fervent fans couldn't tell you it paints a picture of a happy ending. And yet, how much collective imagination have we had about what we could do? Like what we could create going forward. And part of my, I think, picking back up some kind of spirituality came from this place of realizing I think we need tools that are better equipped to help us imagine again. And at its very best, that's, I think, what faith could do is it could help us imagine, hey, we built this world, and for a lot of us, we didn't even build it. We were born into it. But like, when did we lose that sense that we were here to make a new one? Mm-hmm. Like, when did we ever like stop? You know what I mean? Like, that's the shift that you can paint it negatively, and I feel the pain too. I feel the negativity right now too. But there's also like, we've been waiting several lifetimes, I think, to get to a moment where there was enough humility around the table to be like, yeah, it's not working. Mm-hmm. We don't have it fixed. Mm-hmm. And so maybe now we could start again.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the lack of humility, this idea that as human beings, we've got it all figured out and we're living, the pinnacle of what human civilization is capable of, which is clearly not the case. And I like that idea of being in an in-between stage. It's sort of like this is a terrible analogy, but like early, like when special effects just came online with movies, but they were really bad, or like the beginning of plastic surgery. You're like, ooh, that wasn't that good. But 50 years from now, it'll be so you won't be able to tell, it's like that. But we're in that like in between zone where it's like, yeah, it's not working very well.
Yeah.
And it's like what is to come is uncertain, and I think, stepping out to say something about that is what we need right now. And it's beautiful. So when you look at Rob, like how does Rob speak to these issues and what does Rob represent, Rob and his work represent to you in this conversation, in this dialogue?
Well, part of what I'm a little bit younger than the two of you, and I say that only because I think one of the challenges that people my age have had is we have kind of come into the world in a sense. So like we've spent the last decade or 2 decades sort of deconstructing our belief in almost every institution, which, in some ways that's pointing out corruptness, that's saying this didn't serve us well, that didn't work well, and that has a lot of value. The downside to that is those institutions represented our only collective touch points. So what that means is you have a whole generation of people coming into the world, myself included, that almost had to navigate it like we were the first human beings. Like, and the air of that was kind of like, when you look at the world and all the things that we need to sort out and all the things we need to, it's almost like we had cut ourselves off from any tradition we'd come from, which was good because a bunch of the bullshit that we didn't want was gone. But it severed us from looking back to, has anyone faced these questions before? Mm-hmm. Has anyone had to figure these things out? Have human beings been asking these? So I think when I met Rob and I started to experience part of his work, it was like that sense of we need something to anchor us or to root us more deeply if we're going to be the people that grow more fully. Like we're going to need to borrow some ancient wisdom here. This isn't going to just be like a blog post and we fix climate change. This is going to we're going to have to look back and figure out like where do these traditions come from and what did they offer human beings? And in spite of all the bad and all the outgrowth and all the all the stuff that I think people dismiss the whole thing with, were there tools inside of those things that could still serve us now? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I saw in Rob's work initially, was that sense of, when I say humility, I mean, for me as a person, it has been like, I think we're going to need to look everywhere. Mm-hmm. I think if we're going to solve some of the issues that we're facing as a world, we're going to have to look into places we haven't looked before. You know, like, I mean, I think where we're living out right now, it's like we've looked at our national political system and it's like that's not going to be the end. Like, come on, you know, that's not really going to get us out of this place.
I think it's super interesting what you just said, and I'm seeing it in other areas too. Like, I don't know if you've noticed, like, there's this sort of heralding, this celebrating of the traditions of Stoicism lately. That's now become like a cultural movement, like going back to before. And Rob, you know, you're somebody who's painted as a progressive or a universalist or somebody who's putting a modern spin on, you know, these ancient traditions, but that's not really what you're doing. What you're doing is you're going back to the beginning, before the institutionalization of all of these ideas, to get at the ideas themselves.
Yeah. And the word radical comes from the Latin word radix, means root. So a radish is a root vegetable. The radical isn't the person who sort of wandered off into the deep weeds. The radical is the person who goes back to source, who just goes back even farther. And oftentimes what happens is these giant traditions and institutions get built up, and then if somebody says, hey, let's explore over here, they're like, oh, you're breaking code. It's like, no, I'm actually inviting us all to get back to source and our original roots. And so many of these things, you think about, well, like 2nd century Celtic spirituality. So this is 1,800 years ago. At the center of Celtic spirituality was proper care for the earth, that there is an inextricable bond between humans and the soil, and you protect that relationship, and you care for and cultivate the land with an eye for sustainability and loving care. So a lot of ideas...
we kind of forgot about that one.
Well, what's funny, it's interesting, like a lot of people, a lot of ideas that appear like more needed, and whatever language people use, progressive, etc., some of these ideas are thousands of years old. I mean, there's a line in the Psalms about this book of prayers in the middle of the Bible about how even in laughter, the heart aches. The non-duality of your heart. That present within you at any moment is joy and transcendence and euphoria and ache and loneliness and anger and rage. And you are this fascinating... Even the very simple binary, how are you doing today, good or bad? Thousands of years ago, people were witnessing to those simple categories don't work when you're talking about your interior life.
Right.
And a lot of people were raised in a world that gave them no tools for navigating their interior life. So you're just left with just push it down. Just whatever you do, push it down. But you have thousands and thousands of years ago, you have people saying prayers and poems and songs trying to name these depths, because if you can give them language, then they don't haunt you. If you can drag them up, then you're less likely. That which you submerge will come out in some other way. Or you think about like the Hebrew prophets. Like the Hebrew prophet Amos, this is sort of Old Testament. His big thing was you have a widening gap between rich and poor, and that's going to be bad for everybody. And when you have more and more wealth in the hands of a few, that's going to be devastating for everybody. So every person who's ever said, I'm with Bernie, I mean, Bernie is channeling, whether you voted for him or agree with all his policies, when Bernie taps into something and thousands of people go, there's something about that, he's tapping into very ancient truths and impulses.
Well, the Jesus story itself is very much about that. I mean, I went to your Christmas show, and it just like blew my mind because I was like, yeah, I went to church, but like I don't really know that much about it. And when you kind of broke down the historical context in which this story arose and why, in your opinion, it became so timeless and potent, and then tied that to what's going on in our current culture right now, it's like shocking the parallels.
Absolutely. Christmas is the ultimate. I love that, doing that Christmas show, because Christmas is such a neutered sort of, we give presents, and apparently there might be a nativity scene. Right. Although Fox News will have a story about how
a tree and a guy and a fat guy, and like, what does that have to do with?
Right, this is pregnant Jewish teenagers on the run with the boot of an empire on their neck, and the birth of a new kind of king was a political threat to the current king. They believe that Galilee in the first century taxation rates were somewhere around 90%. I mean, you have a whole history of revolt during that time. It was a politically volatile time, and there was a dominant narrative of empire, which was peace through victory, which is basically crush everybody, the Roman Empire. Crush everybody who doesn't agree with you. It's peace through victory because everybody who opposed it is dead. Right. And this story had it's the original Rage Against the Machine. It is, I mean, this story was a loaded socio-political, economic counter-narrative.
Well, yeah, I mean, talk about radical, revolutionary,
absolutely,
speaking truth to power.
And somehow that story got co-opted by empire, which is insidious. I mean, a lot of people talk about the 4th century. In the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine essentially co-opted the Jesus movement. And sort of, hey, people find this compelling. Okay, then I'll take it and sort of co-opt it for my own political purposes. And a lot of people point something really deep, because this Jesus movement was share your possessions, have a common meal, make sure everybody's rent is paid. Sacrificial love is how the world is made better. And your connection with the earth, with each other, with yourself, with the divine. But right away then, right after that, you have the birth of the idea of original sin, which was that people are first and foremost wretched and depraved, as opposed to there's an inherent goodness, that every human being has a dignity and a divine imprint, that regardless of what they've done, they still bear that. There's a holiness and sanctity to every single person. You respect them and look out for them as you'd look out for yourself. Like, you think about how many things in the 4th century, and people say, well, that's just religion, that's just sort of primitive. Those strands get people elected in 2016. I mean, they're still wafting in the air.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, this is the one of the big lines in the movie where you say, I honestly believe that if Jesus was alive today and he would be, I don't know, I can't remember the exact word. Mortified.
Oh yeah, so started religion
in his name.
Yeah.
But then when you turn on the television and you see people draped in flags and carrying guns, and they're aligning this with some kind of religious tradition, it's like somewhere along the way we've lost our way.
Completely. And if you think about the Jesus movement, it was birthed out of, there is a shared humanity, that every way that you can cook up to divide yourselves, there is a shared common humanity that you have with every human being that overrides that. And so you listen to that. It's like you keep your ear bent towards that. And if there's anything at the heart of the Jesus story, it was always the inclusion and the universal embrace of all people everywhere. So the idea of some sort of, well, these people are in, these people are out, these people have favor, these people, I don't know about them, it's just completely contrary to the story.
So, Andrew, you go on the road with Rob and travel all over the place, watch him speak. You interview, some of his amazing co-collaborators. There's Pete Rollins and Pete Holmes, and who else is interviewed in the movie? We have Elizabeth.
Liz Gilbert.
Yeah, Liz Gilbert.
I should tell you a story about him on the road, though. There's a good story. There's one moment.
Tell it now.
We're, I want to say Charlotte, North Carolina. Because Andrew keeps his cool. Like, he's amazing. He just keeps it. But he came bursting into the green room right before I was going to go on, like with this like child at Christmas, like, oh man, all right. And I was like, what is it? And he's like, we have friends. And I was like, we have friends. And he looks and he's grabbing like an extra camera as he rushes out of the green room, and he says, protesters.
Yeah, it's like filmmaker gold.
And it's exactly, I was like, is this like, in your world, is that like gold? And he was, it was like there was like this big gift to him that there was somebody out front with a bullhorn.
Yeah, and you see you see that in the movie. That's from that event. I mean, you had told me this prior. There's people that protest me when I go and speak, and I was like, I thought maybe a couple people standing out front, but I was like, no, those people meant business.
No joke.
So tell me where they're coming from and what they represent.
Man, that's a good question. It's really strong. It's stronger than I knew when I first met Rob. There is, people aren't happy about what he's doing. I mean, an enormous group of people are, but yeah, there's a really strong contingent, and it cuts right to the core of who they are and how they see the world. I mean, I think ultimately more than anything else, I think what Rob's challenging is he's challenging a sense of what he just said: insiders, outsiders, us, them. We're right, they're wrong. I mean, that has been the tremendous conclusion of a lot of religion, is that we're right. We found the answer. And these people over here haven't. And I think to even begin to articulate something that's more inclusive than that is profoundly offensive to people. Because I think religion for a lot of people does simplify a really maddening, complex world we find ourselves living in. You know, it's columns, it's categories, it's black, it's white. And so I think when Rob comes along and says, there's a whole lot more color in this picture, and let's just be honest about the fact there's also stuff we don't know. No humans ever died and come back.
And instead of when challenged by that idea to say, oh yeah, maybe we should look at that, the response is rather to be aggressively dismissive and label him the heretic.
There is a quote, and I really forget who said this, but it was it's not a new quote at all, but someone said, whenever human beings are unsure, we become doubly sure. And there's that sense in which the areas in our life that are most vulnerable, we're the most like strident in the way we just, you know what I'm saying? So when I look at people holding a megaphone screaming their guts out about Rob saying homos can get into heaven, I just think, man, there's actually a lot of pain in there. Like I actually spent time, I remember just in the edit suite, just kind of like, you know, you look through things slowly and just looking at some of their faces and thinking, I don't, you know, I have little kids at home. Like I don't think any of us come into the world with that kind of vitriol. You know, right. I don't think any of us show up on the scene and like have this impulse to. And the other thing that I think Rob really offends people on, and I think the strongest reaction we've had so far to the film to the negative, is that I think it's actually surprised me, but most of it has to do with America. And that's true of work I've done before too. It's like when you touch America, you touch something really deep. And when Rob criticizes the fact that we've put the flag and the cross side by side to really horrendous consequence throughout human history, especially recently in this country, that's strong for people. And I think what it is, and I think it's going back to what somebody said earlier, Rich, I think it's what's happening right now in America big time, and it's happening so fast we can't even handle it, is that when you pull the cross away from the flag, you take off that thin veil of moral superiority or whatever it is we had, and you're left with very naked nationalism. You're left with a sense of like that we're in, they're out, we're right, they're wrong. Like think about that in the religious context.
Without the ability to morally justify it in that way. Suddenly
it just becomes really offensive, and I think no one wants to feel like they're wrong. And I mean, I think about that on any level. You know, I think about that with reactions people have that you probably experience to like what people eat or what. You know what I mean?
It's not quite as vociferous as religion. I mean, there's nothing as sort of, you know, heightened as that. But yeah, you see it in the diet debate wars where, you know, the people that are the least informed are the ones that dig in the deepest and are the loudest.
And there is that question. I mean, there is that question. And one of my primary sources of intrigue with Rob has been that question, as I said earlier, how do we wake up? Because we're in desperate need of human beings waking up on this planet. And why do some people experience something and move to a later stage of consciousness, and why do other people not? And I don't know the answer to that. I really don't know the answer to that. So you see I watch certain people engage with Rob's work, and to some people it's very life-affirming, and it opens them up, it moves them forward to a place of, and to other people that's just really, really offensive stuff. And to me, that is the great question. If you're a person of faith of any kind, I think the great question right now in front of all of us, even if you're not in religion, the great question is, how in 2018, as a person, can you be like someone who holds belief that moves them towards really hope-filled action, and yet be open to when new information contradicts that belief? I mean, I think about that with climate change a lot, because I think a lot on the environmental spectrum. I think about the people that deny that, and I just think about from a business standpoint, like whenever you've backed your life into a corner, like you said earlier, like it's not like we've arrived. But there's a lot of us who were kind of given that view of the world. Like I was sort of raised like that. Like here's human history, like do, and then now we're here. And we did it.
Right. We did
we can close the book.
Right.
So like is your faith, is your religion, is your tradition, is your lack of religion something that opens you up to the possibility that 10 years from now I might be sitting down here with you, Rich, and I might be able to look back and be like, man, there's so much I didn't know. How was I still doing that?
Well, I would hope that you would say that.
I hope so too.
If you do have fidelity to that idea, then you should be saying that at that time, right? So I think it goes back to awe and wonder. If you can live in that place of awe and wonder, then you're open to change and possibility, and you're not hardened by your dogmatic belief about X, Y, and Z. And it requires a certain humility to do that. It's very threatening for a lot of people. So when Andrew says, I don't know why some people can be provoked, and you as a, sort of quote unquote, you've been called a provocateur, to sort of provoke people to think a little bit more broadly or out of the box about some of these ideas. What do you think the difference is between somebody who can hear that and go back and recalibrate versus the person who digs in?
Right. Well, this is the thing that happened in the modern world is you had the birth of the machine, and the machine was built on causality, A plus B equals C. So if you're going to build a flat screen TV or an airport, you're going to take apart creation to understand how it works, and you're going to put it back together in particular arrangements. But that's built on, you need to know that these atoms are going to do this. There's a predictability and a probability there. And so for many people, and then you think about Newton's Principia and mechanical laws of physics, the universe operates according to some rules. Apples fall from trees at a pretty consistent speed. So we were like seeped in this view of the universe, that there are these laws and predictabilities that undergird everything. And the problem is, for many people in the modern world, that thinking spilled over into matters of soul and spirit. So for many people, when you get into the infinite, the divine, that which you can't access with your five senses, but's more real, love, grace, forgiveness, loss, that which you can't access with, the assumption for many people is, well, it must work that way as well. Mm-hmm.
Well, this idea that science and faith are mutually exclusive, and that we've transcended these sort of antiquated ideas of faith for this Newtonian, idea of how the world really functions.
Right.
And, a couple observations about that. I mean, I think I heard you say one time, that's all fine and good until, that hardened Newtonian, physicist or whoever, it holds their baby for the first time. Mm. And that sense of awe and wonder and possibility and impossibility kind of enters that person's awareness in a new and different way.
Right.
And beyond that, this idea, I just lost my train of thought, but it had something to do with, I'll get it back in a second. It was so eloquent,
physics,
too. It was
apples,
amazing. Yeah.
The future.
Well, this
causality.
idea of reconciling like science and faith, right? And making room for that which is beyond. Like, I don't see them as mutually exclusive. Like, the more you learn about science, the more insane it is. Like, the more possibility I see for something that exceeds our ability to comprehend.
And the best scientists are the ones going, and then we learned this, which raised all these new questions.
Well, I think
some of them we can answer, and some of them we're like, we don't know.
Yeah, we don't know, and that's the humility part. But I think with science comes that lack of humility, this sense that as human beings we're capable of figuring everything out, and that we can understand it. It's only a matter of time before we can pin this down on paper. And perhaps our brains are not evolved to be able to see what is maybe right in front of us. Had we had another lobe on our head, or some other sense that we don't know what it is, but our hubris tells us that no, that can't be the case.
Right. So if you go back to what happened for a lot of people, is the assumption was that human consciousness must work like everything else. Like, show me where the buttons, the levers, and the machinery is, and then we'll get everybody farther along. But you take two different people, and two people struggling with alcohol, and you do an intervention with both of them in their living room, and the one says, "Thank you so much. You guys love me this much." And the other one says, "F you, get out of my living room." in very similar circumstances. Why do friends
I've
that
been
we
both
know,
of those guys, by the way.
Yes. Yeah. But think about your friends. Think about even in recovery. Why do certain people go, I can't do this for one more day? And somebody in your other friend, yeah, I'm fine. Everything's fine. Denial, avoidance. It's the great mystery at the heart of the whole thing. There are these great parables Jesus tells. Like he tells one parable to his disciples. It's almost like he's talking to this crowd, and it's almost like he leans over to the disciples and says, okay, here's the thing. I'm going to say some things that are true. And some of these people, they're going to wake up and see it. And some are going to want to kill me. It's as if I'm passing out seeds. And some of this ground is really hard and rocky. And some of the ground is like fertile, and the seed is going to take root. It's as if a number of Jesus stories are as if he's going, I don't even understand how it works. I don't even understand why. I do know that we generally need pain to wake up, or some experience in which our current categories and labels are no longer sufficient. So the number of people, I mean, you think about how many people were taught something about, we're taught that it's something ridiculous like all Muslims are violent or something. And then a Muslim family moved in next door, and they're like the best neighbors they've ever had. All of those previous categories of organizing things fall apart in that moment. And you either entrench, dig in your heels and fight it, or you let it break you and take you into new places. And that's the endless invitation. You think about post 9/11, the trauma of losing all of these Americans in this horrific attack, and you essentially had collectively almost two responses. The one response was, why do these people not like us? Why are we the target of this sort of terrorism?
Why a trade center?
Why a trade center? Which doesn't deny the evil atrocity of killing innocent, but just says, okay, what is the larger thing at play here? Is there something about us building military bases on other religions' holy sites that aggravates people? Have they been saying, could you please not build military bases on our holy sites? And you have a whole series of new questions being asked about the role of this tribe in relation to other tribes. The other response to 9/11, if you could caricature it, would be, these colors don't run. Crank up the Toby Keith. We're going to put a boot in your ass. And you can see it collectively. You can see it individually. You can see it when a friend of yours loses someone they love, and it's just ripped their heart out. And some people become more open, more tender. That loss, they become a friend to everybody who's lost somebody they love. Like they look them in the eyes and say, me too. And then we have other friends who lose somebody they love and they become bitter, small. They're still shaking their fists at the universe about why this happened. It's the great mystery. But what we can do, and the real invitation, I would say now, which we saw in the past election, the real warning is not to let your enlightenment become an obstacle to the enlightenment of others.
What do you mean by that?
I think what happened is we've had this narrow, bitter, brittle right, exemplified by all the Fox News jokes you've ever heard. But what happened in our culture is the left, a narrow, brittle, judgmental left has emerged. But that one's even more insidious because it has an underbelly of arrogance because it's not the right. And I think
which further aggravates the right and entrenches it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And resentment is just lethal to the whole thing. And I think a whole world of educated, intelligent, accomplished people sent a message from the left to the right of, we get it. We're going to make the future. There's going to be driverless cars in no time. I know 2.5 million people get their jobs from driving trucks, but you'll be out of a job in no time. Just give us an Uber a moment, and we'll sort that out. And the real spiritual question hanging in the air is, can you listen to where that resentment comes from? And then I think the failure of the left, I think, is the thing. Like, think about election night, how many people on TV were like, I didn't see this coming. I didn't see this coming. And a guy in a tower, not a metaphor. You know what I mean?
A gold tower.
In a gold tower with King Louis XIV. But to me, what's so interesting is he heard something and his wife said, if you run, you'll win. So he saw and heard something that the most educated, accomplished, in the know folks didn't hear.
Oh yeah, he was
that's interesting.
He was a perfect tuning fork to
Absolutely.
tap into, that world of people who feel hurt and unheard.
Right. And to me, the great spiritual question is the absolute necessity of listening to, how does this system not work for you to such a degree that you would pull the pin on that option? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? That's, to me, like the great spiritual challenge of our day is, how does this system so leave so many people feeling left out? Mm-hmm. And whoever you are, you have a vested interest in that, because everything is intimately connected with everything else. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the really interesting thing that's happening now, is you have all these people going, I think I missed something, which goes back to the humility. I think I missed something about the way this thing works. And that can only lead us in better directions. Yeah,
and I think, using that tuning fork analogy, like you're a tuning fork for that division. Like the protesters show up, and then the people who are sort of vibrating on that frequency are the people that want to hear you speak. And both crowds, appear when you arrive. And that's got to be, one of the things in the movie, knowing your story, I didn't fully appreciate the level of courage it takes to kind of step into this message that you're putting out there, knowing that it is provocative and that for certain people indigestible, and yet understanding that it's your truth and doing it anyway at great personal risk to yourself. Like when you told that story about what it was like when you left Mars Hill, because it's just what you felt like you had to do, and started trying to, reinvent how you were communicating with the world, and seeing how a lot of people were not happy about that. And then less people were showing up to hear you talk.
Oh yeah.
But like sort of remaining true to that. Like that's a warrior's path.
Yeah. It felt like a long, slow evolution in the same direction. Like I just kept following it where it led. But yeah.
So what was it? What was going on? Like, take me to that moment.
Oh yeah,
at Mars Hill, where you realized, like, I can't. This is not my path.
Well, what happened? Kristen and I started a church when we were 28, and it got very, very, very big, and it was amazing. I got to see amazing things. I got to participate, and it was incredible. But I also had this growing sense that there's no way when you have an institution that's that big that doesn't become about preserving and protecting that institute. Like, we got to keep the church running. Mm-hmm. And my interest was not in keeping an institution running. It was creating a space where everybody from every background could access the spiritual depth of life. So it was like, I have to keep going. And because I started touring, I started doing like club theater tours in 2006. So I started touring like a band would tour, like tour bus, and doing like these one-man shows. And that felt like home. Like talking about how everything is spiritual and the spiritual depth of life in public spaces was like, that's where you'd hear your favorite comedian, your favorite band. It was like, this is where we should be talking about these things, not over in the corner. My interest wasn't in a particular group of religious people over here. My interest has always been in what's it mean to be human.
Yeah. And you say, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but you kind of tell this story in the movie where you say, you were a young person and you were at church, and you had a very visceral realization at a young age, like, this is the stuff of life. Like, whatever they're talking about up here, like, this is the most important, impactful, magical, mysterious, beautiful subject matter that a human being could ever entertain, because it is about what it means to be human. And yet, why am I so uninspired?
Right.
Why is this so uninspired? This should be the most inspiring thing ever.
Yeah. Right. We as human beings, and especially like your listeners who say they're not religious, then don't show me your photos from Burning Man. Because you want meaning, you want depth, you want connection and coherence.
Burning Man is a response to that yearning,
to the ache. Absolutely. So we are fundamentally spiritual religious creatures. We are desperate for meaning, significance, and depth. Like, that's the juice of the whole thing. So I just didn't buy some of the categories from the get-go. And when people say, well, that sounds kind of like you're talking about spirituality. Yeah, because you are too. Because we all are all the time. This thing is, what are you going to do with this gift? Where does it come from? What's it mean? Where's it headed? Yeah. What's it mean to be you? What's it mean to be me? So, yeah, I just had this... Kristen and I kept having this sense. Well, it happened very quickly. Oh, this chapter is over, and I need to keep going and just keep doing what I'm doing and follow it where it leads. And this chapter with a local church, that was a great chapter, but I have to keep going and take it farther and talk about these things in spaces where somebody who would never go to church could stumble into this and be like, oh, thank you. Yeah, I needed this.
Right.
This is helpful. So that's how it worked. But then what happened, I did a tour right after, right as I was leaving the church, and I put out a book called Love Wins, and that was fairly divisive. So I did a tour that fall.
You just gloss right over that.
That tour, like, nobody should. I mean, there were cities where I would do like a 1,500 seat venue, and it had been sold out the last time I came through, and like 71 people would show up, and I'd be in the green room, getting ready to go out, and the promoter would come back and be like, "Yeah, pretty empty house out there," and you'd walk out, and there's this cavernous room, and there'd be like a couple people in the thing. And I remember one guy saying, "Yeah, on your previous tours, we'd put the tickets up, and vans of church people would buy those tickets up. It'd be sold out in no time. And now, none of those vans are coming."
Pariah.
And all I just knew, apparently that particular subculture isn't listening, but I knew there are millions and millions and millions of people who are more hungry than ever. So it's like all you have is this deep, abiding trust, belief, hope, conviction that, no, there are millions of people who want to talk about this stuff. And that just keep going. But that tour was, and I remember that tour because I couldn't afford a tour bus, and I remember like going to the rental car place. I said drives, like 8-hour drives every day. And I remember that like I was losing money. So this friend of mine who's like a large man, he was like with me. And I remember we had to get like the cheapest rental car. So we're in a Ford Festiva. We're lost somewhere in Virginia. I'm driving along like,
wonder if anyone's going to show up.
I'm moving to California. We're starting this new life. There are no guarantees. All you know is you have this sense that you just have to keep going.
But you never question that sense.
No. Because and in the film I joke about, Kristen and I talking about, well, you could always sell shoes.
Yeah.
A Spinal Tap reference. I knew I'd rather... Maybe this all dries up and I'll go do something else. But at least I'll have my integrity. I still have my soul.
Which I think honestly,
that was what.
Which I think honestly is a huge part of what I was interested in the film. Is I think that a lot of us are we don't have enough examples of people who are on a path and stick with it. And I think it has cost something. I think it's cost more than you even take note of. Sometimes, Robin, maybe that's true. Like a gift that you. But
denial is my drug of choice.
But it's kind
mine too.
It's kind of incredible to witness, and that's like there's the work itself that you're doing, but there's also like your life signifies something for people, because I think a lot of people listening to a show like this, I think there's a cost if you're doing something purposeful and intentional in the world. You don't just drift there. I mean, Rich, you're that way. Your story's lined with that. Like, yeah. So I'm fascinated by that from a story standpoint, because that is the thing that good stories are made of, and it's the thing that really interesting lives are made of. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's cool to witness that, because it's like Rob can just kind of keep going in the face of all of it, but it is, you line up 10 other people, and I don't think they all would have kept going.
But no, like, it's very Joseph Campbell.
But like I'll be in I'm doing this tour all year long. The Holy Shift tour. I'll be in next weekend is Sacramento, San Francisco, Santa Cruz. It's like a 3-city run next week. I'll walk out and say thank you. I'm so glad you all are here. I'll mean it to the very depths of my bones. Like I have a gratitude at the end of the night when I was just thank the audience. You never know what it's like to show up at miles from home and you all were here. I mean that in a way I could never begin to explain to the crowd. Mm-hmm. It's such a wondrous, no way I get to go out and do this again. I think I'll give, like, this Holy Shift tour, I'll give this talk like 50 times this year. And I'm headed into the team. I'm like at night 10 or 11 now, and I'm more humbled and thrilled to do it. Yeah.
How many talks a year do you give?
Oh, not that. Well, I do like a sermon sort of thing for my podcast.
Yeah.
So that's probably, there's a bunch of those. Then there's like a tour.
There's a few of those.
And then I do these events where I talk for 2 days straight. I do 8 hours a day for 2 days.
So this is the thing that I'm getting at. And like Andrew, I know you agree with me on this. I mean, Rob, you're a very gifted master communicator. Like, you have an incredible acuity for connecting with audiences and individuals, and a facility for tapping into something primal that connects people to whatever it is you're trying to say. And it's powerful, and I see it. There are certain other people that I see it in. You're certainly one of those people. Is this something you've always been able to do? Like, you're so comfortable on stage. You have such a command over what you're doing. Has it always been? Have you always had that? Or obviously it gets better the more you do it.
I was in a band in college, and I was the front man. I'd never sung, but I was like the front man. It was like some version somewhere between Talking Heads and Red Hot Chili Peppers and Violent Femmes.
Yeah.
And Midnight Oil.
Is that on the internet anywhere?
You know what? Apparently it is.
Yeah, is it?
No, apparently it is.
Well, Andrew, you had to dig up everything for the movie, right? You got it? All right.
Yeah, apparently it is.
Send that to me.
So writing songs and sharing them, I was like, oh, because I was never that good at. But when I did that, I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm any good at this, but man, it feels like coming home. And then when I discovered the sermon and realized the sermon was an art form that had been hijacked. That you say the word sermon, and most people are like, and what's for lunch? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm sure your listeners, the word sermon is like anything but a sermon. But then I would say, but hold on, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream. That was a sermon. It was beautiful and dangerous and subversive and poetic, and it was economic and political. It was about the heart, and it was about our shared life together, and it was unsettling and healing and disturbing the comfortable and comforting the disturbed. And no one heard that sermon and went, I don't know, he was funnier last week. You know what I mean? Like. So we sort of roll our eyes at the sermon, and yet what you have heard of some sermons that were like events. They were guerrilla theater meets performance art, So what happened in my early 20s is I stumbled into this art form and was like, I am going to resurrect this art form for everybody. So that's what happened is...
Well, you've claimed it and yes, redefined it. You know what I mean? Like, I listened to your podcast... And I'm like, first of all, how does he just talk into the microphone and like do this incredibly eloquent 45 minutes? Like, I don't know how that works, but beyond that, like, I don't think of it as a sermon.
Right.
Like, this is just these are like your insights, on a whole variety of things. But then when you're like, yeah, that is a sermon, it's like, all right, well, what is a sermon?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, to take ownership of that and to like invert it and claim it as your own in this new expression, I think is.
And I remember at the beginning, when I started doing sermons, is like, I either call this something different because of how many people just want to throw up in their mouth at the thought of a sermon, or I double down on it. Mm-hmm. And I, like, by sheer force of will, just keep saying sermon until you're forced to rethink it. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's literally like you either shy away from it, or you just go, no, they got it wrong. This is what a sermon is. I really love it. I love it more than ever.
I downloaded your program, Something to Say.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and I listened to it over the course of a couple long bike rides.
That was 8 hours.
Yeah, I know. It was like 2 or 3 training rides.
It was 9 hours. That's a run. That's a morning run for Rich.
He's like, it was 7 hours and 45 minutes. That was like my run out before I turned and came back.
But I was like, wow, you really break it down. Like, I was like, how can he talk about this for 8 hours?
Right.
But I was like, oh my God, like I have to listen to it again because I was just riding my bike. I was sort of, it was percolating in my consciousness, but like I actually want to take notes and write it down.
Yeah,
because it was a really powerful primer on like, look, if you want to express yourself, if you have an idea, like let me give you a roadmap to put your best foot forward so that you can create the best version of whatever it is you're trying to say.
The basics of communicating.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to create someone has a blog, somebody just has to give a speech to their employees, somebody has to give something motivational to the team. I wanted to create something for everybody who's got something they need to communicate, to give them as many tools as possible. But you would love, I've been doing these events where people come and bring whatever they're working on.
I'm going to do that,
and
man.
get them unstuck.
Yeah.
You would, because
I'm kind of stuck. I'm kind of stuck.
much.
We talked about this before.
Oh, right,
I'm still a little stuck, and you've extended yourself to like help me through that, and I'm going to take.
We'll get you unstuck.
Yeah, I need that badly. So yeah, it's like, I think this kind of dovetails into what Elizabeth has to say about you. Like, you guys are like, you have this really cool kind of brother-sister relationship,
yes,
but you're both creative powerhouses, and it's about creative expression. It's about how do you communicate your ideas in a compelling way.
Elizabeth Gilbert is unbelievable. And she and I were on this tour with Oprah Winfrey. I always say Oprah Winfrey in case people are funny. But
not the other Oprah.
Elizabeth and I started doing these Q&As, and where we would just go out into the parking lot and we would just sit on stools and take questions. And she would bring these like 4-paragraph answers that were just mind-blowing. And then later she put out a book called Big Magic.
Yeah.
And I was like,
I love that book.
No wonder she was crushing the Q&A. She could without writing a book, but so many of the things she was saying are in that book. She is truly an extraordinary I mean, just what she has to say and how she says it, I'm speechless.
So Andrew, when you're on the road with Rob, like when how did it differ from what you expected? Like, what did you take away from that experience that perhaps was different than what you imagined it would be?
I don't think I imagined just how much, because you're right. I mean, like if we're being honest, like Rob has a very, very high ability in some of these areas, and not everybody has that ability, maybe not even that capacity, and he's kind of like performing at the top of his game. And I think what's fascinating is when I'm with him, he continues to have like that posture of a student, and he's continually like fascinated by the whole thing, like he's just learning how to do it. And he continues to, it's not just the like I read 3 books before breakfast thing, it's also just the posture of like, isn't this interesting? Like, what am I learning in this moment? Which is, I think, I've been around people before who are communicating from a place of certainty and power. Anyone who's been in a church has seen that. And it's almost that thing that you alluded to of like, I figured it out and I want to let you know. Versus there's just this sense when you're around Rob, and everyone that knows him says this, it's like this orbit, because I told him one time, I was like, when I leave you, when I spend time with you and I leave and I go back to my life, I find myself loving my life more. Like it's somehow like everything's gotten like more vivid, like something about like, and I think that just comes from the fact that he is a person who is immensely like all the stuff that he's talking about isn't from a place of like, I figured it out now and I want to let you know. It's like
curiosity,
genuine curiosity, and also just a lack of cynicism and a lack of fear. I mean, to be honest, like you said that, Rich, about like, I think Rob can sort of like navigate around a lot of the critics and the hate, but just doesn't make a decision from a place of fear. And like, that's a pretty cool thing. I mean, like when the election rolled around and he texted me and said, I'm going to go do a series of speaking events in the Deep South called the Bible Belt Tour. It was like, oh man,
yeah,
that seems ill-advised, but
good for the movie.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah.
By the way, I loved having Andrew along because I loved being like, "Do you see that? What do you think about that?" Like encountering.
So, what would be
things.
an example of that?
Here, well, I'll give you an example of that. Rob's doing Rob's really accessible at a lot of these events, and so afterwards,
this thing in Ohio.
Yeah, right. This is Ohio. Is that right? Is Ohio? A guy comes up. Rob's doing a book signing because this portion was like with the book. The publishing company had sent him on this little book tour. So we're in this bookstore. This guy, a lot of love. People are giving him hugs, appreciating him. He's signing books, taking pictures. And this guy comes up and he like slams down this thing on the table. And he's like, "I'm making a documentary about you."
He's waiting in line.
I don't agree with you. And I'm giving, like, it's almost like a subpoena. He's like, "This is your one chance to do an interview.
Served.
You've been served." It had that vibe. And I opened it up. But it's like, what's amazing is like, I know a lot of reactions to that. And like Rob laughed for like 30 minutes about that.
You can't make that stuff up.
It's this thing. I think this is what it is. There's a dose of joy, and to be honest, I mentioned this even at the premiere. I think there was even a season there where, coming off the election and the dismantling of the EPA and all these things that were really upsetting to me, I almost resented it for a minute. Like there was almost this thing of like, it was almost like, Rob, it's more serious than you think. Like there's real stuff. And I think what I experienced...
Why do you think I'm in Ohio tonight?
I think what I experienced was that sense of like, it's so serious, like it's so heavy that it also is... It's that you talk about the light, heavy light, that there's a light on the other side of heavy. And I think I think people wouldn't expect that amount of joy in the midst of articulating some of these ideas that are not always light.
Yeah. And I mean, Rob, is that something... Is that just part of your constitution, or do you have to cultivate that sense of joy and levity and awe and wonder and curiosity and optimism, or you're just baked that way?
I'm probably baked that way, but what I kept noticing is the people who came in hot with a case to make, something within me, whether it's an evolutionary impulse, what's the reptilian brain, something within me braces. When I feel like somebody's coming in to show me, you know what I mean? There's like a heaviness that they need to let me see how serious. There's something within me that just braces myself. And that I just noticed the people who, it's like they were dancing. It's like they were hearing music that I couldn't hear yet. It was like an element of seduction. I did this, actually one of the turning points is I did an event with Bishop Tutu and Dalai Lama. And I was expecting it to be heavy. I was like, these two, this is going to be heavy. I mean...
Oh, they just crack each other up.
Bishop Tutu with Truth and Reconciliation is this person went into this village with a machete in 1994 and slaughtered everybody in this person's family but them. Now the person's going back to the village to apologize for killing their whole family. And this person forgives them publicly, and there's documented evidence where they then become friends. So that's what he's doing. Dalai Lama, when people are like, I got some haters on Facebook, Dalai Lama has some haters. China. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like he's been on the receiving end. So these people work at a, is there a higher or deeper level? And they walk into the room from opposite sides of the room, and they meet right in front of me, and they hug each other, and they start tickling each other and giggling. And I was like, what is protocol here? Like, what is... I actually, in that moment, I was like, what do you do? So I literally just pulled out my phone and took a picture. I have a picture 2 feet away from the two of them who are hugging. And then they did this cute... They put us all on stage in a row, and a crowd could ask questions. And they would say stuff like... I remember Dalai Lama turns to Bishop Tutu and looks at him and says, have you gained weight? And then they would just die laughing.
Up.
And I was like, oh. Because in the alternative wisdom tradition, there is the wisdom of the heaviness of life. And we could all die tomorrow. We're barely hanging on. We're hanging on by a thread, the whole thing. But if you actually enter all the way into that, the terror and fragility of life, you end up with, if you push through even farther, what you arrive at is, but we're here today. So we might as well do something today.
Yeah.
So what I noticed is how many people had got to the heavy. The whole thing's falling apart. The system is rigged against us, let alone the EPA, let alone industrial farming, and they park themselves there. But if you keep going, you get into this other space of, I know, it is, you're right, but we're here, and we're breathing, and we're walking around, so let's take a crack at some of this stuff. Let's see how many people we can get drinking water to. Let's see if we can make some difference. And that person's now actually dangerous. Because they're coming, and that's why I talk about...
It's almost a bullet, but you
light,
become
heavy, light.
bulletproof.
You become weirdly bulletproof. And I remember doing an interview 2012-ish. It was NPR, and they started quoting one of my critics on the air. And I remember for the first time they got done quoting that critic, and instead of my usual, well, that guy's instead of my lawyer, like, okay, I'm going to make my case, I'm going to defend. I remember I just burst out laughing, and I was like, that's the critique? I'll tell you what that is. That's a Nerf bullet. And I started critiquing the critique with joy. Like, that's it? come on, come at me with something more.
Diffuses the whole thing.
Yeah, come on. You can't make something like it became like play. And that's not to negate the seriousness. It's just, if you move into that space, now you actually are in the space. First off, the ego has taken a proper backseat. And all the people I know who actually are moving the needle in some way, they have they've tapped into there's some punk rock in there. Like, I know we're subverting the system. Cool, huh? And people I know who are organizing themselves in some new political ways, they're all in. They're also laughing. The artists I know, the doctors, I mean, the people, I'm sure you've seen that, it draws you to them because in some senses they're hearing music and they're inviting you to dance with them. And it's just a fundamentally different metaphor. It's a different way of seeing it.
Well, there's a strength to that too.
Yeah.
Like, it's a feeling of like, there's a center of gravity.
Yeah.
That just feels like, oh, I'm past, like, whatever that noise is over there. Like, I'm cool. I can be over here and laugh. Like, it's not affecting me in that way.
Right. And you're not mocking anybody. It's not like you're not, but all the people, like, think about all the people running small businesses who every week is a grind. Can they make payroll? If you can move into, hey, we made it another week, check this out. And now you're really in the moment, and now you actually have a shot at joy. And actually part of it came because I was trained as a pastor. So at early 20s, I got a job in a church. And one of the things that happens as a pastor is people call you when they're in a rough place. And right away, like 24, 25, I was doing funerals of people who died of AIDS when no one was talking about that. Or people would call the church and say, I'm about to kill myself. Can I talk to a pastor? So all of a sudden my phone would ring and I'd pick it up and it'd be like,
you're 24 years old, 25 years old.
I distinctly remember visiting a guy in prison when I was 25 who was in isolated lockdown because he was violent. And they led me in this little room. They said, the prisoner will be here in a moment. And I was like, to the guard, I was like, where are you going to go? And he's like, well, you'll be in here with the prisoner and then I was like, where are you going to be? And he's like, I'll be out there. And he starts to lock the door. And I was like, what happens if he tries to hurt me? And the guy was like, the guard says, I'll be able to watch it on my monitor.
Oh my God.
So I would or I remember going to the ICU unit at the hospital and visiting these young families whose kid was in the clear plastic box. And then I'd go home to dinner with my family. And I would try to reconcile the suffering. Because when you're a pastor, like at the funeral, they invite you. You've never met some of these people. They invite you to the funeral home to help plan the funeral, and you sit down and realize all these people hate each other. And I'm supposed to somehow, in the midst of this death, make an experience that will somehow honor the person who died. And I would go home to my family.
Situation.
It was an impossible situation after impossible situation. Then I go home to my young family for dinner, and I couldn't reconcile the suffering I was seeing with the blessing and goodness of my own life. And it like broke me the other way. It was like, oh, the only way to do this is to move to some place of gratitude. It's the only way I'll ever survive is just, but I do have today, and we are here, and there is this thing unfolding, so let's watch it, and let's see what happens, and let's witness to it. So some of this happened early on out of great disruption and trauma almost.
Did you read the Book of Joy? It's by Doug Abrams. It's the story of Bishop Tutu and the Dalai Lama like getting together for the Dalai Lama's birthday. Did you read this book?
I know what it is. I've not read it.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah. And it's about their relationship. It's about their friendship. And it's about not only how they're able to maintain that perspective of gratitude and levity in a world of suffering, but how, we can all bring more of that into our own life. And it's a little book. It's easy to read or whatever, but you should check it out.
I'm so glad somebody wrote a book on that, because experiencing it up close, I was like, it literally for me was a transformative. I think I'm witnessing like the actual, the secret to the whole deal, or I think I'm seeing how it actually works.
Yeah. Well, the dynamic between them, because they're like little boys,
absolutely,
who like love each other deeply,
right,
and it speaks to a larger, sort of perspective of how they navigate the world.
Yeah,
I did a podcast. I did a podcast with Doug too. You could listen to that instead
Oh,
of reading
good.
the book,
Cool,
but to talk about it. But
I'll save
but
you
it's
reading
cool.
the book.
Yeah. Anyway, all right. So Andrew, what is your aspiration for the movie? Like, not like in terms of how many people see it or whatever, but like, what is your hope that people take away from the experience of watching the movie?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think when I make something, it's very, very personal to me, and I think part of why you saw me kind of emotional at the premiere is these things are they're inextricably linked, not just to a season of my life, but they always have at the core some question I genuinely don't know the answer to when I come in. You know, it's not just that I don't know is this going to fit together into a movie. It's that I don't know the answer. Like, I'm looking for something, and so for each, I can look back on each of the things I've made, and that's been true. And so for me, I have this kind of profoundly life-changing experience making this film, and it opens me up. It gives me keys to unlock doors that had been locked several years ago, and it you know, I'm just at the beginning of figuring all this out, but it's inspiring on a very deep level to me. And so you have that experience, and then this week the film gets released and it gets to go out there. And I think in some ways you want it to do for other people what it did for you. Like, I want people to have the experience of having a 2.5-3 year conversation with Rob. And I think the benefit of that is I want people to feel less alone. I think there's millions and millions and millions of people in this country and around the world that were handed something very reductive in the form of religion oftentimes. I think it did damage to their personal psyche. I think it strapped them down with guilt and fear and shame that they're still carrying. And that they were made to believe if they challenged that, if they moved away from that, they were betraying something, or there was something broken about them. Mm-hmm. That's what I think it goes.
There's guilt and shame that comes into that.
Yeah, so I think for me, a story like this is you're not alone, you're not crazy. The thing you've rejected, you're rejecting for a reason, because it's been bastardized, and it's a horrible, cheap knockoff. It's like in the dollar store. It's the little figurine. It's not the real statue. So, number one, just know that. Know that. And then number two, perhaps you could open yourself up to leaning in and getting some of the insight that some of these traditions have brought us without taking the whole thing. You know, like when I was growing up, it was like you were given the whole package, and it was like take or leave everything. Mm-hmm. Sign on the dotted line.
Yeah, there's no a la carte.
No.
Right?
No, there's nothing a la carte.
This is how you're going to vote. This is how you feel about this issue, that issue.
Because, and I mean, that's on a personal level what I hope people experience, but I also think on a very collective level, I think what you were just talking about, Rob, and what you're articulating, Rich, is that sense of not only do we desperately need people to wake up, we need people who are going to be awake and alive and available for the long haul. And I think I've even experienced that in my life, where it's like I've had that very youthful, you know, I see an injustice or I go experience something that really rattles me, and it's like you're just swinging wildly at it, you know? You're just swinging. And it's from a very beautiful place. But I think when I look at someone like Rob, honestly, when I look at someone like you, Rich, I think like I'm trying to set up my life in a way and my family in a way so that I can be someone that makes things that are helpful for a long time, that I can have these experiences and I can share them. And I want to be doing that when I'm 80. And I think that there are certain tools, insights, words, poems, prayers inside of this big amalgamated thing we've called religion that offer help to do that.
Yeah, what I hear in that is this sense of, or I guess what I want to say is the path to truly redressing what ails us doesn't necessarily come in the form of a fly swatter to say Scott Pruitt needs to step down as head of the EPA. Mm-hmm. What we really need, if we want to truly solve these problems for the long term, is to raise consciousness. Fundamentally, right? We need to raise the bar on our awareness, our connection with who we are fundamentally as human beings, and what that means, right? Spiritually, emotionally, physically, and ethereally, really, right? that is the solution. And it's amorphous and it's confusing and sort of unclear and at odds with kind of the forces of where our culture is right now in this moment. But ultimately, that's the path forward.
Well, and that's like, I think that's beautiful. And that's like, I think for me, the realization that I'm thinking a lot about right now is sort of stepping back and realizing like, we have to get really honest about the fact that all of the stories that we were given to explain the world around us were not created equally. And some were funded for certain reasons. Some were designed for certain reasons. And a lot of the fallout comes when we like have leaned into a story thinking, like the story of American consumerism that you mentioned, wasn't designed with our well-being at heart. It wasn't designed with the good of the planet at heart. It was designed to make more profit for these types of, you know? So I think like backing up from some of these stories that we've lived inside of and sort of saying in a whole new way, how do we write a story for the future that is based on what we now know we need globally and what we know leads to, you know, human well-being personally? That is... that's wildly different than the suicide machine that we're living in, especially in this context in this country right now. It's not working. It's hurting us. Like, it would be one thing if we were ravaging the planet and dominating entire groups of people, and we were like the happiest people on the planet. But I think, you know, you mentioned the school shooting. I think what like gets to me every time there's that like check on like how unwell, like how deeply unwell we are, is the sense of that's coming at the cost of, you have those two parallel things, our own personal unhappiness as well as our own personal sorrow, as well as globally speaking. So yeah, I think we need new tools. I think we need to look in new places. I remember that after the election, the editor of the New York Times, he said, "What did you learn covering this whole process?" And he said, "We didn't take religion seriously, and we're going to hire more religion writers." And it's not because he was saying like religion's done all this good stuff for America. I think he was saying these stories, whether you like them or not, whether you believe in them or not, whether you think they're helpful or harmful, they have played a central role.
It's the driving heartbeat.
It's the driving heartbeat. Mm-hmm. And so I think for me, it's like, I hope people can look at a film like this and say, okay, we need to take seriously what this story has brought about. We need to take seriously where we now find ourselves as a result, and we need to pull out the good without sacrificing it to a small minority that's tried to claim the whole thing as theirs.
Mm-hmm. And do it not with a hammer, but to use the analogy or the metaphor that kind of interlineates the movie. It's more like surfing, right? Which is how the movie ends. Spoiler alert, right? This idea that you have to ride with the sort of currents of culture and delicately coast it in order to, you know, plant those seeds of renewal.
Yeah, and consciousness rises step by step by step, and the patience to understand that when people are at a certain place, you don't skip steps. So even for a lot of people realizing maybe there's a larger I've always voted Republican, maybe I shouldn't. That's actually a giant step forward. Or I should probably eat less meat. Giant step for some people. And the maturity to know you affirm movement wherever you see it. Mm-hmm. You may be way down the road, but anybody, anywhere, any tiny little bit of movement, you celebrate it. Mm-hmm. As opposed to the arrogance of, well, if you were just caught up to me, then you'd be okay.
Well, so many well-intentioned movements just hamstring themselves for their inability to fan the tiny flames of forward progress. Absolutely, because it's not ideal or perfect.
Right. As opposed to it's all happening on a continuum, and you cheer on anybody taking any steps.
Which is the danger, and when you don't recognize what the story was, you repeat it. So, like, I remember having that experience, Rich, when I started into the plant-based world, and getting into some of the vegan culture, and I'd have these moments where I was like, oh no, this reminds me of fundamental Christianity.
It's very similar.
It's very
similar. You didn't. Well, but you're doing that, so you're not this, or you're doing it wrong.
We're just trading stories rather than stepping back and saying, wait a second, that I'm right, you're wrong. this is my tribe. That they're not my.
It's not serving us.
It's not serving
it's
us.
Not.
Right.
You know. All right. How long have we been going for? Oh, we've been going for a while. I have to ask you. Rob
You're
Bell.
looking at your
Rob
notes.
Bell. No, I've closed I haven't looked at these at all. That's like my security blanket in case I
nice.
have that brain fart and I can't think of anything. How does it feel to have a movie out there called The Heretic?
I've always chafed at the word simply because I love my work. I love making things. And the idea that somebody somewhere doesn't like it is like, okay. It's just always been like, it's not interesting to me. And I was like, no, I've sort of fought against it. I sort of laughed that people would use that word because when somebody uses that word, my first thought is, oh, you just aren't familiar enough with your own tradition because nothing I'm saying is new. And actually, Andrew calling the movie The Heretic is like weirdly I've had to sort of make peace with it.
You're forced to wrestle with that.
I am firmly in Eminem in the last scene in 8 Mile when he takes it all and just owns it. And well, if it's when he first called, I was like, oh, I don't like that word, and then I thought, man, that is a badass thing to call the movie.
Yeah. But also, like, who is the real heretic here? What is heretical?
Yeah, and I think when I realized what he was doing there, is he was like, people call. Well, how did it happen? You told somebody you were calling your...
Well, it's definitely clickbaity.
Listen to this story.
Rich, that's how I do
laugh.
everything.
Yeah,
I think what's clickbaity?
Yes.
You were at lunch or something?
I was at lunch with. I was back in Atlanta where I grew up, and I was with someone, and they were very. It's a very conservative religious little thing, and someone asked what I was working on, and I told her that I was making this film about Rob Bell, and she like put her fork down, and she was like, he's a heretic. And in that moment, I was like, thank you.
That's the name of the movie.
Did you know that was the name of the movie?
I absolutely knew.
Did you how do you respond to that?
I've never responded. I've just said, I just said, okay, I'm going to make a movie about it. I mean, it's like, yeah. To me, it's actually a powerful world. It's a powerful word because it's historically loaded. History hasn't always. It's interesting if you really parse through where those people typically sort out now retroactively. And I just never have understood why we value innovation and change and forward progress in so many categories. And yet when it comes to our deeply most sacred held beliefs, we don't let them evolve with what we now know about the world and what we, you know what I'm saying? Like, so to me, it was just kind of like insanity. Like when I was getting to know Rob and like following the work, I was like, the fact that that's the thing that's being like, wouldn't it be insane not to question this stuff? Like, I don't understand, like, the same is true with all this stuff. The same is true of America. The same is true. It's like a very small group of people kind of claim the moral high ground, and they come to define, like the center of gravity, as you mentioned, gets to define what it is.
Unassailable.
So then anyone coming up that hill, and you do, I mean, whether it's people eating differently, whether it's people, you are then labeled as the this or the anti that or unpatriotic or un-Christian or a heretic or whatever. And I think that whole metaphor is broken. And I actually think that reveals itself to be something. I actually think there's a key in there. I really do think there's a key in there. Because if you really look at that thinking closely, it's just so dangerous and so flawed. And history is strewn with examples of when we've just done groupthink and we've unquestioned, and power has just, I mean, like, we don't have to look that far back.
Yeah, no, not at all.
I would also say one thing about the title. One more thing. It's humbling because you have to make peace with how people will respond to you and your work in the world. And the ego wants to control the narrative the whole way. Mm-hmm. But all you can do is do your work in the world, and then it will be understood, it will be misunderstood, it may be appreciated, it may be slandered. There's this deep peace you have to make that you either stay on the couch and you just become one more passive observer doing comments on YouTube, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or you get in the game and you get skin in the game and you get a little bloody and you do your work, and you align your life around being a participant, not an observer. And if you make that shift, if you cross over into that, then there's a good chance some of what you do will be misunderstood, or you may get rocks thrown at you, or protesters out front.
I mean, the trope is anybody who's ever done anything
exactly.
controversial. It's like you can't have one without the other.
And if you can make peace with that on the front end, then now you have a shot at joy. But if you're constantly letting that determine your joy, it'll always be an elusive thing.
Yeah, non-attachment.
Right.
And to Andrew, I asked you, like, what is your aspiration for audiences? What kind of experience do you want them to have with this movie? On some level, you have an intention and a point of view, but you have to detach from that experience because they're going to have their own experience, and that's going to be what it's going to be, right? And there's something beautiful about that, but there's also something that provokes that, like, sense of wanting to control the story, right?
Totally. Well, I think about it as you're saying, like, how you want to control the whole story, which is... I laugh you saying that, and then you let someone make a documentary about your life without any creative control.
Yeah, like no creative control.
That's always
but also it would have been weird if you were like, okay, we'll do this, but I get to, like, craft it.
Yeah, but
the
that's
way that
how
Rob Bell want to do. Like, then it would
so
be
many
like,
people
then
do it like that.
Yeah, but it would be like, oh, this is just
terrible,
this is being driven by the ego. It can't be that way. Right.
Right. It's much more. This is a much better story.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, we got to wrap it up. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I love both of you guys.
I love you too, man. I
love
your
you
work.
too, man, and I love coming to your house.
Thank you.
I love seeing you.
Love the movie. You did an amazing job. It's a courageous work, and I was honored to be at the premiere to experience it with an audience for the first time. And I won't lie, craned my neck a few times to see how Rob was doing. I was like, yes, you were a pretty good poker face throughout, but I really enjoyed it. And I can't wait for the world to embrace what you guys work so hard to create. I wish you well, and I want to know what's next. What are you doing, Andrew? You got a new movie you're working on? Are you going to be predictably tight-lipped?
Yeah, I am, but only because I don't know. I sort of have this thing where these things work sort of one at a time for me, and I think we're finishing this now, and then the next thing will open up. I stressed out for a long time about that. I have a lot of friends who can make like 7 things at one time. They're so productive. For some reason, it just works in this way. And I remember it was right about this time where we had finished The True Cost, and Rob and I met and started talking. So I'm open. Right now I'm kind of like excited because there's something new that always comes up right now. So I'm not telling you not because there is something and
no, but you're not actively like, I need my next project. Like, you're somebody who waits for the inspiration to hit
These things are too long and too difficult to only kind of be interested. For me as a person, I don't know. I just have my one way of doing it is just kind of like heart, soul, body. I just like viscerally have to be chasing after something, and that I trust that will happen again. I love these. I love doing this. It is intoxicatingly fun to make this. And I'm thinking, even as we're having this conversation, it's just making me realize like what a gift it is. So every time we get to do it, it's just kind of like, whoa, we got to do that again.
That's super cool. What about you, Rob? You're touring?
Yeah, touring. I think we're about to announce another couple legs, so probably through the end of the year. So probably coming to a city near you, good listener. And then there's always a new teaching for the Robcasts. Those come out on Mondays, my podcast, and then other stuff that I get very excited about. But I don't like to let it out till it's ready. And then I like to spring it on people.
You always say, like, if somebody says, well, what do you do? You're like, I make things.
Yeah,
so you're in your little stuff. Back house making things.
Yeah, there's some good stuff brewing right now. It's fun.
Cool. All right, so the movie is available on Amazon and iTunes worldwide right now?
Mostly. We're working towards worldwide. It's a lot of places.
Yeah.
There's like a few countries that keep emailing, but we're working on it.
Right. All right. Should be easy to find for most people out there. And if you want to learn more about Rob, robbell.com, all his dates and all his good stuff, all his cool, you can download Something to Say. You're on the Radiohead model, right? Like,
Something to Say.
Right.
Pay what you want.
Pay whatever you want. And until next time, gentlemen.
Yes.
Thank you. Should we go eat some food?
Oh my goodness. Yes.
Most definitely.
Rob, will you take us out the way that you end the Robcast?
Oh, yeah. And my rich roll, brothers and sisters, may grace and peace be with you every step of the way.
I love it. Peace and plants.